All right. We are live. Welcome back to the Reintroduction Podcast. I am your host, Mina Suiris, with my co-host, Chris Stefanos. And we are here today on the season finale of a great season, our first season of the Reintroduction Podcast. There's so much we wanted to talk to you about today because there's so much that we learned. We started this project during COVID, just like a lot of other friends have started their projects during COVID when everyone was at home. It started with just a set of questions. We always get together as friends and we always like to talk about things. So we said, you know what? We have a lot of great questions. People are asking a lot of great questions, questions that we've had ourselves for a long time. So why don't we take a little bit of time, do some research, and put it together? And instead of just having these conversations with each other, we can just have them online. It has proven to be a fantastic experience. We learned so much from it, but it was also challenging at many times in terms of preparation, in terms of content. So we're glad that we have made it through 15 strong episodes, and we're here
Yeah.
with you today as the season finale to talk to you about, what we learned from the first 15 episodes, what we hope that we can what we hope that you've taken from it, and what we hope to do with season two. What up, Chris?
What up?
What's
Well,
going on,
I
man?
mean, that was such an eloquent introduction. I'm glad that you're now doing the introductions. I mean, I
I
feel
will
like
never.
you just bring a softer voice and, instead of my
You were making
loud.
fun of my soft voice in the beginning.
Yeah, but finally you got a good microphone situation set up. Speaking of, check out your microphone system. It's
What?
serious.
What? Come on,
We
man.
we definitely have advanced and improved our quality of this production over the last 15 episodes.
We still got a
Uh,
long way to go,
a long way to
though.
go. But yeah, this season has really been it's been surprising in terms of how much feedback we've gotten from people about their experience with this podcast, how many things they've learned, the things that they themselves had misconceptions about, and how this podcast really has challenged their perspective of who God is.
Hmm.
And I think that's been like the biggest blessing for us is, you know, sometimes we all have these misconceptions, or often we have these misconceptions about God. And when we see Him clearly, or when there is like some baggage that we have that is carried in relationship to who He is, it's really nice when that kind of unfolds and you get a clearer picture. It's like all of a sudden people are just, you know, can worship better, can pray better, can spend time with God better. It's a different ball game. And I'm not saying that this podcast is what did that, but I'm grateful that we have maybe been part of people's journeys and getting to know God a little bit more.
Yeah, I think what we've tried to do is we tried to be real because we didn't try to sugarcoat things. We don't want to um, rain a bunch of Christianisms on you. We wanted to have a real conversation about things that we were challenged with all the time, and questions we've had growing up, or questions that we continue to hear, or things that we continue to have doubts about from time to time. And what we've learned is that when we talk about these things out loud, it helps us seek answers much better and helps us conform ideas better because we each have a different piece of the puzzle that we can bring to the table. We've
Yeah.
also had an array of amazing guests. Um, Everyone we've had was superb in terms of expertise, in terms of genuine spirit, and in terms of what they brought to the discussion. We really didn't have to do anything.
So I guess, Mina, that brings us to our first question. What surprised you this season about the Reintroduction podcast? I mean, it started, like you said earlier, with just some questions that people have been talking to us about, a Facebook post that I posted, a few years ago. But what has surprised you about this podcast?
One of the things that really stood out to me was how open um, our guests have been in sharing from their personal experiences, and also how open you've been, me, and just basically willing to dig deep and willing to, share from lessons that we've learned without worrying so much about how is it going to be perceived, or um, I'm worried about what people are going to say, because at the end of the day, these were difficult questions.
Mm.
And then we've had a whirlwind of events that happened in 2020 that kind of flipped the whole table upside down. And we found ourselves in the midst of a lot more conversations that we initially had planned on having. In the
Yeah.
beginning, we planned it. Yeah, right.
I think it was 12 episodes originally, and
Yeah,
we ended up with 15. We ended up tweaking a bunch of them, replacing them. It's crazy how much has happened in 2020.
yeah. So that's one thing that really surprised me is how open our guests have been in terms of sharing from their experiences. What about you?
Yeah. I mean, I think what surprised me was how much of a detour we took this year in
Mm,
terms of our original intent and kind of where God directed these conversations. You know, our intent initially, like you were just saying, was just covering a few topics that people often have misconceptions about. And then all of a sudden we found ourselves in the midst of a global
mm,
pandemic. We found ourselves in the midst of protests, people getting killed in streets, sexual abuse within the church. There was just so much stuff that was happening, and we just found ourselves smack in the middle of it, and have being forced to have these conversations that I think many of us didn't feel comfortable having prior. But it was really eye opening to see how God was using this podcast as a means of allowing people to feel like they were also part of the conversation through us and through the guests that we are bringing in.
mm.
So I think that really surprised me. And it surprised me how much people said, "Man, what you said really was exactly what I was thinking," or what Mina said, or what one of your guests said. And that's powerful to me when we feel like we're being used by God to have these difficult conversations that I think often will push the narrative or challenge how people perceive things.
Yeah, and the one question that we really like tried to answer is why why is God so misunderstood at the end of the day? And that question kind of found its way through every episode, and it kind of in different tangents. Why is God judgmental? Why is God controlling? Does God really care about me and the details of my life?
Mm,
Is he does he punish by evil or by pandemics? Is he really is he changing? Does he change from who he was in the Old Testament and who he is in the New Testament? So these were questions that kind of revolved around why is God so misunderstood. So as we recap the season, um, what are some simple takeaway points from these episodes that you think can help us summarize that question? And before you do that, if you're really tuning in to this episode as your first episode, we want you to pause. Well, you can't really pause when it's live, but we want you to stop and we want you to go back and listen to the previous episodes to give you an idea of at least the topics that we've discussed and how we've interacted with them. But tell me, Chris, what do you think? What are some big takeaways in terms of why God is so misunderstood?
I think God is misunderstood because we think God is like us. Like, I
Mm,
think we sort of characterize God in terms of relationships that we have or have experienced in our own life. A lot of people, like, Mina, you shared this in an earlier episode that a lot of people, will characterize God in the same way as their earthly father, like kind of, make associations to their earthly father with their heavenly father.
mm,
Um, and I think the misconceptions are often based around how we perceive we would treat each other. So when we talk about, is God angry? And if we do something wrong, is he going to smite us? I think oftentimes we think that when we were children, if like our parents disciplined us when we did something wrong, that's the exact same way that God deals with us. Even when our parents are doing it in anger versus doing it in love. So it's really interesting to think about how our relationships shape our perception of God and
mm,
how our experiences in terms of the things that we go through, the challenges, the hurts, the pains, the struggles, the losses, all of these things shape our view of God. So I think that's like to answer your question. I mean, I think that's why people have misconceptions about God. What about
Yeah.
you?
I want to comment on something that you said, because when you talked about how our own relationships kind of project themselves on how we see God, I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine, and when we were talking about the concept of just seeing God as a father, and she was saying that I never had a good earthly father. So when I think of God as a father, it doesn't resonate well with me. It's not
Yeah.
something that I want, and that's something that sometimes we take for granted, and that we project our relationships, our earthly relationships, on how we expect God to be. We forget. I remember I was reading about Princess Catherine, one Empress Catherine in Russia, and basically during the time of Enlightenment, she was approached by a philosopher who was saying, "You know what? You need to take these ideas and bring them to Russia." And she wrote back to that philosopher and she said, "Whatever is happening in Europe, when it's written on paper, it sounds great, and you can, you know what, preach all these great ideals and idealisms on paper. But once you try to translate them to people, people are not as smooth as paper. They're more touchy, they're more sensitive. It takes a lot more work, and um, that's how God has chosen to reveal Himself. You know, we've talked about
Mm,
where God is and why He's not seen in these things. God has chosen to reveal Himself through the most broken, which is us, all of us. Yes, there's some text, there's the Bible, there's all these, great sayings of the fathers that we get in tradition, but the biggest testament to God is us,
mm,
in the way that we were created, in the way that we were intended to live our life, and that's something that sometimes we take for granted.
mm,
So when we talk about, um, is God judgmental? No, He's loving. Is God controlling? No, He is loving. Does He care about the details of my life? Yes, He is loving.
mm,
That really ends up being the epitome of all the answers. Is that
mm,
throughout all of this, we see God, um, as a loving Father in every single detail, um, of it all.
mm.
What do you think
You
about
know,
that?
you know, it's funny, Mina. You just reminded me of a conversation I literally had today while I was treating a patient. So this patient and I have had a very good dialogue about God over the years. And in fact, he told me today I was listening to your podcast recently, which is cool. You know, now I can point people to this podcast. That's a bit also been a big surprise of mine, is that people have actually been interested in listening to this.
Mm.
So he's talking to me and he's telling me, I wanted to ask you a question about prayer. You had an episode on prayer, and you know, oftentimes when I come to God in prayer, I just sit before Him and I say to Him, God, how do you put up with this mess? And that, like, and in the genuineness of His question to me, like, I looked back at Him and I said, I ask Him the same exact question. Like, I don't know why God puts up with my mess. I don't know why God puts up with our mess. But I think what you just said right now really resonates, because it all goes back to Him being a loving Father. Like, it all roots back to love. It all roots back to, like, the beauty of God, and in His love is that He enters into our mess. He enters into our brokenness. He enters into our chaos in order to heal it. And I think if I were to want to summarize, my hope and my takeaway from this season for people in terms of like misconceptions, like if you ever feel like you have a misconception about God that doesn't realign you back to the truth that He is love, that He accepts us in our brokenness and in our mess, like, just remember this moment of this conversation in this podcast. And that really touched me. Like, in this dialogue with this person who I was treating today, he said, and then he asked a follow up question that really, also struck me. He said, how do I accept myself in that mess? Like, okay, He accepts me. How do I accept myself in that mess? And I just think that's the part of this podcast that we can't work on. We personally, we can present who God is, but the acceptance of oneself in the understanding of who God and in his love. The acceptance of that love is on each and every person who is listening.
Yeah, and well, yeah, exactly. And then we have that, we have our own, um, we have our own views and our own problems and our own sin that make us reflect on that ourselves and say, you know what, how can God accept me the way I am? And the only thing that we can do for each other is that reassurance, is
Mm,
that I tell you when you have that doubt, I'll say, bro, no, he does, and he does, and he has, and he always will.
mm,
It's something that is never changing. It will be there until the end of days. No matter what, how big, no matter how small, no matter how twisted, he's always going to give that second chance. He's always going to sit
mm,
there with wide open arms. Even if you say, you know what, even if you say, yeah, what if I'm not Christian? What if I hate God? What if I told God I hate you?
mm.
Yeah, even then, there is really no, there's nothing, there's nothing that is big enough that God is going to say, no, you're too much, bro. You can't.
Yeah.
It's too late for you.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's part of the beauty of this journey in getting to know God more, right? And the more that we know him, the more that we understand him, the more we have a better picture of him, the more that again the scales start to fall, right? Because we all approach God initially with some scales on our eyes. And then as we start to see him clearer, the scales start to fall. The true revelation of who he is starts to happen. And I've been recently, personally, just a public confession, I've been recently struggling a little bit about this idea of, like, as a new dad and trying to figure out how to balance, like, being a new dad and, like, spiritual life and reading and praying and finding time with God, like, trying to juggle two kids. And I've been really struggling with that. So I was meeting with one of my spiritual fathers the other day, and I was, like, confessing this and asking for guidance. And he said to me, don't worry, God is not disappointed in you.
Hmm.
And I feel like that was so nice for me to hear, because I feel like oftentimes, again, I have a true perception of who God is. I think a clearer perception of who God is. But
Hmm.
am I willing to participate in the process and not let myself be a hindrance to it?
Hmm.
And I think that for me was so reassuring to know, like, God sees me in this season. God knows that I'm juggling two newborn babies. He knows that there's a lot going on, and he's not disappointed in me. And for
Yeah.
anyone who's listening right now, if you're going through a rough season where maybe you're like, okay, I've listened and I've heard about I've heard things in this podcast that has been reassuring for me, but I can't. I'm stuck. Don't worry, God is not disappointed in you.
Hmm. That's a great reassurance, and I think from time to time we all need to hear that, and we all need to make sure that we are that person to someone else,
Mm,
because every one of us needs to hear it at some point, especially if it looks like you've got your life figured out and you look like you've got it all together, because oftentimes on the inside things are in shambles. It's okay to hear that, because
yeah.
we long for that connection as human beings, and God has put that in us, that he manifests himself not just through text but through
Mm,
people. This is the biggest way that God projects himself to us.
mm,
Life is difficult, and it will always throw things at us that will be difficult to manage on our own. And having that accountability and friendship that can kind of do that for us is so needed. If you haven't had that in your life, go out and try to do it to someone else,
mm,
because you know what it means to not have it. And God is faithful. He always finds a way to reach us, even if we've given up.
mm,
But another thing, also, to go back to that bigger conversation, is of um, misconceptions about God and us misunderstanding God, is that we need to learn, and I think that's something that I learned this season, is that we need to learn to ask a lot of questions
mm,
and not be satisfied with bad answers,
mm,
because a lot of times there will be bad answers. And at the end of the day, also, we haven't given you any big answers to any questions. We basically, what we did is that we just started the conversation. We wanted to have a conversation around these difficult topics, but we don't want you to give up. Anytime you struggle understanding something that you're reading or a concept about God that doesn't resonate with how you feel God should be, you should be asking those questions, and you should be asking them and seeking the answers from as many different resources as possible, because God can reveal himself to a certain degree in the way that we search for him, and we can't
Mm,
take that for granted,
mm, mm.
right? So um, with that said, Chris, um, did you expect this? Did you expect this to turn out the way it did?
No.
Hmm.
And I think there's still so much room for improvement. Like, I think season one was good, and I think season two, the things that we have planned are even going to be much better. Like, God willing, the more that we see God and the more that we pray and the more that we communicate with others in terms of what people are, asking questions about, I think the better that this podcast will be. Um, but man, I didn't think um, I didn't think it was going to turn out the way it did. I thought that nobody was going to listen. I thought it was just going to be our moms who were going to be cheering us on and saying, "Good job, Habibi."
My mom is always
Uh,
tuning in.
yeah, I mean, my mom is, liking it, sharing, doing all this stuff. That was the furthest to I thought our audience would be.
Well, big
And
shout outs to our moms
big
because
shout
they're
out to our
big
moms.
supporters always.
Big supporters. But because I thought my mom would be the only one listening, initially I was like, all right, well, we can be crazy, we can say things that nobody
Yeah,
would say because nobody's really listening.
yeah,
And as we started to realize that people were listening, we're like, okay, well, interesting. People are messaging us. People are eager to hear about these conversations, and I'm just grateful that people are willing to hear to two dummies like us, to tune in and listen to the conversations that we're having. And great. I'm grateful that we brought on some really smart people so that we didn't have to be the only two talking
for
all the
sure.
time. Because I think nobody would have been listening if it was just the two of us.
It's very true.
What about
Very
you,
true.
Mina?
No, same. I think there have been challenges that were kind of expected, but not really sure how that was going to turn out. One thing that stood out to me is that speaking to an unknown audience when you do a podcast, I guess as we're experiencing with this and experimenting with it, you really have no idea who is listening.
Mm,
It could be, a 12-year-old, or it could be a 50-year-old, or it could be someone who's a strong Christian or someone who's heard of Christianity before. So the challenge was, can you deliver content that is simple enough for someone who's never heard about this before to take something from it, and at the same time, someone who is very familiar with it to also learn something. And I
mm,
think that that's a learning curve.
mm.
I think that's something that we hope that we can continue to improve on, and to do better with. Um, Active listening is another big thing that um, I learned how to do throughout these episodes too,
It's
especially when you're
hard.
having this live.
It's hard. And learning
Yeah,
how to follow up with next questions and figure out how to improvise when
yeah,
the conversation is going in a different direction.
for sure. Yeah, so learning like conversational skills, we're it's a different style than what we're used to. When you speak to your patients, it's just you and someone else. No one's listening in, no one's recording. Or when you're giving a talk, you're
Yeah.
just like exactly who's sitting in front of you, and you can kind of gauge feedback based on like the what yeah, even nonverbal cues. You can just like,
Yeah.
okay, I should move on from this point, I should spend some more
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
on this point. But but here you don't have that. So I didn't expect this um to turn out, but I'm grateful for the lessons I have learned from it more than anything else, for sure. And it makes me excited about what we can bring on next season. So now that we've discussed season one, misconceptions about God, what else could there be to discuss in season two?
Ooh. We want next season to be the reintroduction to humanity.
Mm,
All right, let me explain what I mean by that. So, when God created man, right, he gave man, some responsibilities. He made the animals for man. He told man to tend and to keep the garden. He told man to have a relationship with his spouse. And he intended all of these things that he created to have a specific purpose. Now, somewhere along the line, due to the fall and due to human sin and brokenness, all of that has gotten disoriented, out of alignment, not where it needs to be going. So our hope this next season is to reintroduce you to the intent that God had for all of his creation. What is the purpose of his creation? And if he's created us to be something, and all the things around us he's created for us, what is the potential that those things have? So Mina, tell us some examples of those things that we're talking about.
Okay, so but before I do that, let me make sure I understand you correctly. So what we're saying is we are doing a season on the reintroduction to humanity, where
Mm.
God basically created man, he created the the earth and the universe, and he created a lot of tangible things in it, whether they're, inanimate objects or, animals or nature, everything that's around us. And there is a relationship between all of these things, between man, man and woman, and man and nature, and men and things.
Mm.
So what we want to talk about this season is that we want to talk about, first season we talked about misunderstanding God and misconceptions about God. And now we want to talk about misconceptions about how humanity is perceived today and what it was intended to be in terms of relationship with each other, relationship with creation in general, and relationship with inanimate things, right? So what we want to talk about is that, I mean, there's so many things obviously that can kind of fit into this. It's not just like one or 2 points, but a lot of things that we're thinking topics. Some of the topics we can discuss is that we want to talk about singleness. Why, we often see that, relationships and marriage is the one way to go, but what about singleness? What about those of us who might never get married?
Mm.
How can we live a life fulfilled in an earthly way and a heavenly way that God has
Yeah.
intended for us?
We want to talk about the environment and what is our role in the environment. There's a lot of conversation about the environment and environmentalism and what is the role of us as Christians when God created man and told him to tend and keep the garden. What does that mean? And what is our responsibility towards creation, towards the trees, towards the animals, towards all these different things?
Yeah,
So that's
we
another
want to
thing.
talk. We want to talk about money and being
Mm.
rich and being affluent. What is our responsibility towards all of that when we are living a great life here in the big US of A, and
Mm-hmm.
our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world are not as fortunate. We want to talk about issues like women in the church. Um,
Mm.
a lot of times we feel like they are underrepresented, underappreciated in so many ways. How did God intend it, and
Mm.
how can we make sure that it is experienced and it is lived in a way that God has intended it, for it to be?
We can't tell you all the stuff that we have in store because otherwise, you may be, those four topics I'm not interested in, and I don't want to tune into season two. But there's a lot of stuff that we have in store that we're going to be praying about, that we're going to be researching, that we're going to be inviting guests to for the next season. So you definitely, if you thought season one was good, or if you thought it was mediocre, if you thought that you wasn't good at all, give season two a shot. Hopefully, we'll launch it sometime early next year, but you know,
Early
give it a shot.
2021. And then we'll see then if COVID is still around, if that has any restrictions on us or how it goes. But we do, if you really enjoyed the season, we hope that you can tune in. If you didn't, like Chris said, we hope that you can give us a second chance and give us some feedback that we can learn from. If you've got some topics in mind you'd like for us to discuss, please shoot us an email or send us a message on Facebook. There's so much that we're open to discussing, and we'd love to hear from you. And we promise to stay as controversial as always, because Chris always likes to be controversial and he's rubbing off
Always.
on me. So so we're glad to have had the opportunity um, to have you as our audience, honestly, because we are honored, and we are it's our pleasure to have had you as an audience for season one, to have learned from all the feedback that you have given us so far, from your encouragement and from your support. And we look forward to learning so much more about you and from you in the next episodes and season to come. We want to tell you at the end, to recap season 1, is leave room to be wrong. We see that in today's society, especially with everything that's happening. It's hard to be wrong. And sometimes we have been wrong about God, but we're just too stubborn to see it. Give God a second chance. And you know what? It's good to say, where we discover wonder, we rediscover God. Give yourself a chance to rediscover God and wonder about him, and wonder how he can be loving and how he can show you his love in many different ways, more than what you would expect. You know what? Say, wow, this is gorgeous. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm wrong. You know, take time to reflect on the nature, on the goodness that have happened in your life as of lately, and give God a second chance, even if you haven't seen it so far. It's okay to be wrong. We've all been wrong at some point in our lives. And it's okay to give God a second chance to
What
show
do you
you
mean? What do you
himself.
mean? We never know. I totally agree with you, man. I totally agree with you. We need to, all of us, me, first of all, needs to be willing to admit that I'm wrong very frequently. And in the acknowledgement of being wrong, there is room to be corrected. And in being corrected, the scales fall. So I love that you just said that. I love that like, ask questions, be willing to admit you're wrong, and be willing to research. You know, maybe we're wrong. You know, if there's something that somebody has heard this season that you're like, no, I think you guys are wrong. I want to have a conversation about it. We're open. We want to have dialogue. We would
Absolutely.
actually would love to bring you on the episode and have a dialogue that's controversial. Because I think it's in the discourse. It's in being able to have conversation with somebody that's different than you and that disagrees with you, that there is open to learn, open to understand that, you know, we don't have to see everything exactly the way the other person sees it, but we need to lovingly respect one another. And I think that's the hope of what next season, you know, will shed light on, is how, you know, what we are supposed to be. How are we supposed to be as humans? What has God created us to be? So yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I'm also, you know, to echo Mina, we are very humbled and honored that you would have listened to us. And we just hope that you'll continue to pray for us, and you continue to, you know, pray for this podcast and for what we're trying to do here. Because truly, our goal, first and foremost, is to point to the beloved, to point to the one who is often blamed for things that he shouldn't be blamed. And if we can be part of bringing clarity to who he is, man, we've had the greatest honor in our life.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Thank you, Papa Chris.
Thank you, man.
So if you
Any other closing thoughts before we wrap up season 1 of the Reintroduction podcast?
No, I was going to say, just make sure that if you haven't done so already, subscribe to our Facebook page. Do subscribe to iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. Like the page so we know you're there and you're listening. Send us some feedback. We really, really appreciate all the feedback that we've received from everyone, but we're looking forward to some more, because we're looking to improve and learn some more from you. We've enjoyed the season very much. We thank you for all of your support, and we can't wait to see you again next season with a lot more exciting topics, exciting guests, and more talk about Jesus.
Yep. Thanks, Mina. Thank you for blessing, you know, me as your co-host. You are fantastic.
It's been my honor, Papa Chris, having you as a friend and a brother and a co-host.
And Mina told me today that we're now married publicly. So, you know, I'm
We are
honored to be.
official.
I'm honored to be married to you publicly, Mina.
We are
Um,
online.
yeah, yeah. I mean, like the Facebook page, send us messages, just to echo what Mina said. And we look forward to seeing you next season. In the meantime,
Amen.
check out old episodes if you missed any.
Amen to that. We'll see you next season.
Thanks,
Peace.
guys. Later.